Hello, my name is Prue Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment, and welcome to this webinar that ACITI is hosting. We are so pleased to have with us Professor Poppy Winanti, who is coming to us from where she is currently a visiting fellow from the Indo-Pacific Research Centre at Murdoch University. We're so pleased to have you with us. Let me just provide a little bit of background on your professional experience. So obviously you're at the Indo-Pacific Research Centre at Murdoch University at the moment, but you are currently Professor of International Relations at Universitas Gadjah Mada in Indonesia. Your research interests focus on global and regional trade relations within the global political economy, Indonesia's economic diplomacy, the political economy of natural resource management and governance of extractive industries, sustainable and equitable energy transition, and perspectives from the global south. So for the topic for this webinar, which is the insights on the Australia-Indonesia economic relationship, you are so well placed to give us your views on the nature of that relationship, but equally in terms of the current developments happening in the global economy and the geopolitics that is currently underway with President Trump and the huge disruption that his policies are causing in the world. We're really pleased to have you providing Australians with an Indonesian perspective on what's happening with those issues. So thank you so much for joining us today. I thought we might start the conversation by looking at the importance of the economic relationship with Indonesia from the Australian view. So obviously the current Australian government has undertaken a review into the relationship and produced a report in September 2022 called Invested, Australia's Southeast Asia Economic Strategy to 2050. And that was undertaken by Nicholas Moore, former Macquarie Bank chairman. So just, I guess, I'm not sure if there's any introductory comments you want to make, but if you want to launch into that topic of the Australia-Indonesia relationship, economic relationship broadly, feel free, or if you just want to make a few opening remarks, Poppy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Prue, for the opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity for me to share my thoughts on the dynamics economic relations, especially as you mentioned earlier that we are currently under uncertain kind of situations with the what we call as the Trump 2.0 kind of era. So that gives us somehow kind of challenges that we have been through, like Trump 1.0 has also give us the sort of experience. So now we are entering the era where we can find the Trump 2.0. However, I would like to start my talk with the assessment regarding the change in Indonesia sort of political situations, especially the change in Indonesia's leadership will also affect the way Indonesia is building relations with Australia and also, responding to the current global political kind of tension. As you know, that Indonesia just recently, last year, we had a new president, and then this is also attracting some sort of Indonesian situation. How then the current situation with the new president will affect Indonesia's relations bilaterally with Australia. As you mentioned, that Australia is also paying attention to Indonesia and Southeast Asia in more general, and how does this new leadership in Indonesia will also affect Indonesia's geopolitical kind of response. So I'm going to start with that before we can discuss the Indonesia and Australia in more specific. So we can see that the situation with the current Indonesia's presidency, we see the key differences with the previous sort of president. At least we can see or probably anticipate it two aspects that we can see the differences between the current president and the previous president under Joko Widodo. We have seen so far at least the current president is going to be much more active engagement in terms of the national relations. And then there is a tendency that the current president will be having more sort of like stronger defense ties with the neighboring countries, including Australia, obviously. So why then we will see more active engagement under the current presidency with the current president in Indonesia? Because we see that President Prabowo seems more comfortable to present himself in the international forums. This is completely probably different with the previous president, who was kind of relying on his Minister of Foreign Affairs in dealing with the international kind of relations. In that sense, then the current president is not going to be only active pursuit of the bilateral economic relations, but also in the global stage in more kind of general sense, including also later on I'll discuss the Indonesia's membership in the BRICS Plus, which was also heavily affected by this kind of new leadership in Indonesia. The second aspect that we will see from the current administration is also the tendency to have stronger defense kind of. As you may know, that the current president was the former Minister of Defense under the previous president, right? So with that kind of background, and he's from the military as well. So it seems that we can see that how the current president will be much more proactive in enhancing Indonesia's defense capabilities. He's going to be also emphasizing the importance of fostering the robust kind of defense and security partnership with the international allies, notably also with Australia. And we can also see how then he is promoting joint military exercise, defense technology transfers, and also in order to make sure that Indonesia's national defense will be also contributing to broader kind of regional stability through the collaborative initiatives with the key partners in the Asia-Pacific region. However, despite these kind of differences, we will also see some sort of like similarities and also continuation when we are talking about the Indonesia's orientation of foreign policy under the current president and the previous one. At least we can see on the three aspects. The first one, we will see the continuation of the commitment for the Indonesian government to what we call as the non-aligned foreign policy. And then we will also see that the emphasis on the economic cooperation, despite the fact that there was also tendency for the defense ties, but then economic cooperation will be kind of the primary or the main kind of drive for the Indonesian foreign policy. And then the current president, in my opinion, will be also continuing the previous kind of initiative to develop and to establish the downstream industry, especially regarding the critical minerals, which is also closely related to Australia's relations with Indonesia. The continuation regarding the commitment for the non-aligned foreign policy, at least on the paper, we can see that Indonesia is expected to maintain what we call as this non-aligned foreign policy approach. It will also shape the economic relations with the countries like Australia, even though we need to be really careful to see the manifestation of this kind of principles when we're talking about the how then the continuation of this principle when it relates to serving the national or probably domestic interests. So that's why non-aligned to some extent, but then probably will be more characteristic of driven more by the national interest as well. So the current president, in my opinion, will have sort of like the aspiration to gain more sort of like global recognition. And then how then the non-aligned foreign policy will be combining with the aspire to be more well-known in the international forum. Again, the examples of Indonesia's decisions to be part of BRICS Plus can be seen as the shift in foreign policy in Indonesia, non-alignment, but there is a tendency to sort of like grouping to certain kind of, coalition. The second continuation, as I mentioned to you earlier, is regarding the emphasis on the economic cooperation. Both the previous president, Joko Widodo, and the current president have underscored what we call as the crucial importance of fostering economic cooperation as part of the central theme in Indonesia's bilateral relations. This is also kind of shared, reflecting their shared vision regarding strengthening trade partnership, enhancing the investment opportunities, and also promoting sustainable development. By focusing on this, we can see that both leaders are still prioritizing the economic collaboration, while then the mission is also to improve Indonesia's competitiveness in the global political arena. And one aspect that we also find it important is the initiation from the previous government regarding developing the downstreaming industry in Indonesia. It has been the priority of previous government, and I think that will be continued under the current presidency, because this is still in lining with the aspiration of the current president to be more well-known, and especially to enhance Indonesia's positions in terms of the global value chains under this kind of industry to the critical minerals. Indonesia is rich of the natural resources, and making sure that no longer only exporting the raw materials. So that's why I think the continuation under the current president, as compared to the previous one, will be emphasizing more on the economic cooperation, supporting the downstreaming industry, and also navigating around the non-alignment foreign policy. So I'll start with that time, then we will see how then it will affect the Indonesia and Australia relations. I will stop there.
That's such a useful summary of the key changes that have happened with President Prabowo coming to power. Very interesting. But of course, in terms of those objectives remaining as a non-aligned country, but similarly trying to, I guess, work with in a recent paper that you've just released, which looks at Indonesia's work to join both the BRICS Plus as well as the OECD. So I think there seems to be a lot happening where there will be tensions arising with trying to achieve these different objectives, trying to navigate, as you say, between the OECD type countries and the OECD type principles that OECD countries try and instill in the global economy compared to the BRICS approach. And of course, coming on top of that, there have been several years where I think even developed countries have shifted more towards industry policy, which now, as you mentioned, within Indonesia, that desire to try and build up the downstream industry. It's something Australia has frankly tried to do as well. I mean, we've benefited hugely from exporting resources, but there is this shift principally for national security grounds, but equally for climate change reasons, to try and build up our own industry. So like Indonesia, Australia is trying to do that as well. But that creates, I guess, tensions. I think a lot of Australians will be excited by the idea of Indonesia being more proactive in international fora. Indonesia is a very big country. The growth potential is massive and very exciting. I think people will see it absolutely that way. So in terms of then looking at the bilateral relationship, and you've already talked about, I guess, some of the differences, President Prabowo's desire to be more engaged internationally compared to President Jokowi's, I guess, preference for leaving international engagement to his foreign minister. But do you see a shift from that change in the Australia-Indonesia relationship and the economic relationship in particular?
Well, in my opinion, regarding the bilateral relations, especially the economic relations between Indonesia and Australia, there will be not much change. I think the current government will be also committed to implement the IA-CEPA as the basic of the framework for strengthening Indonesia and Australia economic relations. with additional sort of like defense ties. So that's the difference. However, focusing and committing to implementing the IA-CEPA will be also the priority of the current government, because I think the current government also realized that under the IA-CEPA, this is the platform for both countries to strengthen their economic relations. We see that before the IA-CEPA, I think two countries were somehow wasting, in my opinion, wasting their geographical proximity, because as we know that prior to the IA-CEPA, both countries are not the major trading partners, right? Despite the fact that we are geographically pretty much close, and we have a very sort of like strong relations in terms of the bilateral relations. However, it wasn't really implemented in reality in terms of the economic relations. So I guess the current government is not going to jeopardize the opportunity to enhance and to strengthen the economic relations between Indonesia and Australia. The data shows that for the IA-CEPA, for example, well, the trade relations between these two countries were relatively somehow like underdeveloped, right? Neither country featured like prominently as the trading partners for the other. Australia was not among Indonesia's top 5 trading partner, either as a kind of export destination or as an import origin country, nor Indonesia is significant for Australia. That was before the IA-CEPA, right? The data from, I think, 2016 also indicated that Australia was listed as Indonesia's 9th biggest trading partners. However, Indonesia's share for the Australian trade only small portion as compared to Australia's trade with other nations in the Indo-Pacific region. It was really like around 2% of the Australia's trade, with no sort of like significant growth within the past decade. So that's why I think I found it very interesting because Australia has more trade relations with the distant economies, rather within the region, the closest with Indonesia. So that's why I think it's very important for the current government to also maintain and then being committed to implement the IA-CEPA, considering this kind of situation. Also, the data shows that prior to the IA-CEPA, for example, in terms of the bilateral investment, it was also relatively weak. Neither country serves as the significant kind of investor one to another. Very low kind of numbers in terms of the investment. However, we can see somehow as a trend, a positive trend in terms of the two-way investment from both countries. So that's why I think if you ask whether the current government is going to invest more in terms of the bilateral economic relations, I think the framework under IA-CEPA will be still the primary kind of framework for the current Indonesian government.
And investment was a real focus for Nicholas Moore's study, Invested, trying to encourage Australian companies to look at those investment opportunities, which of course, when you see investment, you then see trade follow. But it is a conundrum to me why Australia and Indonesia don't have far more trade. And I guess I'm wondering whether what's happening with the United States, this will be a real opportunity, I think, for Australian companies who, I expect, if President Trump goes through with his promise of imposing tariffs on pretty much all their trade partners, so I think he mentioned that there might be some exceptions, but and I think a lot of his demands based on the list of issues that the US is looking at for levying tariffs against, so things like intellectual property rights rules and sanitary and phytosanitary requirements, and taxes. These are things that will be extremely difficult for any government the Australian government or any government being asked to change their taxes, for example, will find it difficult to move. So I think Australian companies really need to be much more prepared for seriously looking at opportunities in other markets. And yes, Indonesia seems to be a no-brainer. I was reading in the Financial Times this morning what's happening with the Chinese economy, which again is a really important trade partner, obviously both for Indonesia and for Australia. But the growth in labor, in wages in China, and the impact that that's having on the manufacturing sector in China. This article was suggesting that Indonesia, for example, was one of those countries which is really going to benefit from that, with the growth of manufacturing, because of the workforce in Indonesia, which is skilled and able and relatively cheap. So real opportunities for growing manufacturing, which again suggests great opportunities. But of course, we've talked about opportunities for a long time. So I'm just wondering, maybe this President Trump, as much as he's causing heartburn across the world at the moment, might actually be a good thing for the Australian-Indonesia relationship.
Well, I agree with you to some extent. However, we also need to be more careful because obviously the Trump administration, especially trade policies under the Trump, have significantly impacted both Indonesia and Australia. However, we also need to be careful because the impact will be different to Indonesia and to Australia. The reasons are because, well, there are several reasons why the impact will be kind of different for Indonesia and also for Australia. For the first thing, Australia's, let me check the data. For the United States has a surplus with Australia. While then Indonesia, the United States trade is deficit. So as you can see that the United States is targeting those countries that causing trade deficit for the US, but not so much, quote unquote, to the countries that they are surplus, having surplus. So that's why in that regard, we need to be, yes, it will impact Australia and Indonesia, but then the impact probably will be different with the first fact that Australia's with the US has been having the surplus with Australia, while Indonesia is, the US is deficit with Indonesia. So that's why Indonesia is much more what we call as the target as compared to Australia. Even though compared to other Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia's trade relations with the US, the deficit suffered is not as much as a US deficit with Thailand and Vietnam, but still, it's still deficits. That's why I think Indonesia is going to be much more targeted than Australia. That's one aspect. Another aspect is regarding the political sort of like commitment. Even though now I'm kind of doubting that kind of reason as well, because US is being also sort of very strong to Canada, who was also a long kind of ally. The European countries also, Australia in that regard is part of the US ally. Very close as part of the global kind of Western group, right? But Indonesia, especially with the current seat in the Indonesian foreign policy, being member of the BRICS Plus, that also another aspect that we need to consider, that the implications of the US trade policies also will also differ from Indonesia and Australia's. So in that regard, I think we need to see how then it will go. Again, Indonesia is also much more interventionist in terms of the trade policies, that probably also causing another issue as compared to Australia, for example. So that's why yes, Donald Trump's sort of like trade policies will also affect Indonesia and Australia. However, the implication probably will be different. So that's why the strategy both countries will also, I guess, should be defined differently. But that doesn't mean that Indonesia and Australia are not having opportunity to collaborate together in order to, responding to the geopolitical tension causing by the Donald Trump's, trade policies.
Yes, I agree. I think there is still a lot of information to come out of the US before we can really make any clear determinations on how different countries are going to be impacted. But I do sense that even if Australia, a rate is charged on Australian exports to the US, is if it's low or if it's zero, just the uncertainty of policy, domestic policy, as well as trade policy, I think it makes it difficult for companies. Yes, there'll be the opportunities to sell quickly, but at the same time, just the uncertainty, I think, is a risk, and that comes with costs. So yeah, I agree. We need to wait to see what President Trump announces. I think 2nd of April, they're calling it Liberation Day, which, yes, seems quite bizarre. One thing I did want to turn to, though, was you've recently released a fantastic paper looking at Indonesia's, as I mentioned earlier, efforts to enter both the BRICS Plus, but also the OECD. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what you say in that paper, and I guess some of the challenges and what that represents about what Indonesia is trying to do internationally?
Well, yes, Pro. Yes, I wrote this paper at the IPRC as part of the, my fellowship there. So yes, to be honest, for us, when the current president, I think it was only weeks or even days after he was inaugurated last year, then he made this kind of statement that we were going to join BRICS Plus. And it took us by surprise again, because for the last couple of years, especially for the last 2 years, there has been some sort of like public engagement from the Indonesian government, and then for the academics, think tanks, civil society, business community, to discuss how then Indonesia's preparations for Indonesia's accession to the OECD. So we were the mindset, the preparation was, okay, Indonesia was going to join the OECD. And then all of a sudden, after the inauguration of the president, and then he made this statement saying that, okay, we're going to go with the BRICS Plus. And we knew previously that the previous president kind of showing the hesitation, joining the BRICS because of the calculation, geopolitical tensions, and so on and so forth. So to be honest, when this statement was made, even the academics found it very surprising, and we were like, hold on a second, what is actually the current government trying to do, with the BRICS Plus and stuff? Among us, especially my background is international relations, right? And then among the academics within the international relations discipline, we were also somehow kind of split regarding should we joining the OECD or should we joining the BRICS Plus. In my opinion, those obviously giving the different kind of situation for Indonesia. The current government is, as I mentioned earlier, that has this kind of aspire to be known globally, and then BRICS Plus probably will provide the platform and the opportunity for the current government to achieve kind of objective or the aspiration. However, in the long term, it is important for Indonesia to show to our partners, especially in terms of the economic relations, to show to our partners that we are having significant domestic reforms in order to meet the international or global standards, which can be done via our accession to the OECD membership. So yes, BRICS Plus will provide Indonesia's government a new platform to defend a global South kind of, interest, to defend global South kind of aspirations, to reform the existing Western domination of the global governance. Yes, it was provided under the BRICS Plus. And it was serve Indonesia's interest, especially in terms of their short-term kind of interest. However, in the long terms, we do really need to be careful because domestic reform still needed. And then, in my opinion, OECD is still the best platform for Indonesian government to undertake this kind of domestic reform. The BRICS Plus also, why then, in my opinion, the BRICS Plus is giving Indonesia's or driven by the political motive, because in terms of the economic kind of calculations, yes, there would be some sort of like opportunities for Indonesian government to diversify its trade with the other BRICS Plus members. However, the existing trade relations, Indonesia biggest partners for trade relations already China and India, and both are already our biggest part of the prominent partners. And if the BRICS Plus would be seen as the additional kind of the trade relations, that it has to be beyond India and China. However, with the current situation, that will also give Indonesia's government kind of challenges, as we know that Russia, Iran, they are still under the international sanctions. So that's why it will give the Indonesians sort of like limitation to expand the existing trade relations outside China and India within the BRICS Plus. In addition to that, yes, Indonesia will have the opportunity to access the sort of like alternative funding, especially for the green transition, infrastructure under the new development bank, always under the BRICS Plus, but that will be only additional to the existing international financial supports with from mainstream institutions. So that's why, again, I think it's very important for the Indonesian government to still sort of like dip to its OECD's accession, because, well, it will give us the benefit in terms of, undertaking the domestic reform, which is needed, but by the current situation for the Indonesian government, because the domestic reform is inevitable. And we need to show that we follow also the international standard, especially if we want to, establish that kind of long-term investment trade relations with diverse kind of countries as well. Yeah.
It's so interesting, because obviously the OECD represents an approach to economic governance that in some respects now is sort of the old approach, in as much as it's about removing barriers to trade, encouraging inward investment, sort of deregulating, or at least making regulation clear and transparent and easier for business to navigate. But at the same time, so seeking to accede to the OECD, the Indonesian government equally is pursuing its industry policy and its downstream processing. As I said earlier, many countries are doing that more and more now. So there are those inbuilt tensions which you sort of feel, well, they're going to have to resolve themselves at some point down the track. And I think that the attempt to join both the BRICS and the OECD is this wonderful example of Indonesia trying to make both work for them. And I guess that's practical, isn't it? That's a pragmatic approach. We want to be non-aligned. We want the benefits of being a BRICS member as well as the benefits of being part of this OECD club. So I think it's almost the most sensible way to go these days. Things are so uncertain where the world is going to land, in the middle of or at the end of this Trump presidency. It seems like a very pragmatic approach.
Yes, I agree with you. So that's why earlier I mentioned that despite the fact that on paper, we will see the continuation of the non-alignment sort of like orientation for Indonesia's foreign policy. However, we will also see somehow kind of more pragmatic kind of approach, because now we are dealing with the uncertainties in the global political arena. OECD is needed for a country like Indonesia in order for conducting the domestic reform. However, on the other hand, Indonesia is also having this kind of global sort of like aspire that something is not completely right when we are talking about the existing global governance dominated by the Western powers. So that's why I think Indonesia somehow, in my opinion, especially the current president, is kind of eagerly being part of that kind of movement, that we need to be more known globally. Then there should be something is done in terms of the global governance by representing and also by voicing the global South kind of interests. So that's why this is really huge, in my opinion. This is really huge, sort of like effort from the existing and the current government, navigating between the ambition to be part of the global South powers. But at this time, we also realize that there has been some sort of like domestic issues that we also have to deal with, and then reforming domestic sort of, internal issues are also necessary to be done by the government if we want to be more, we want to increase our competitiveness in the global political arena. So yes, it is a huge, huge thing, and we will see how it goes. To be honest, as an academic, I do expect that the government is still opening up the, public engagement, especially regarding how to utilize the BRICS Plus, the opportunities available under the BRICS Plus, and then the accession process to the OECD should also be seriously taken by the government. So that's why I think engagement with the wider public, stakeholders, really, really needed. But then to be, we will see how it goes, to be honest.
Absolutely. I mean, it's always so important to make sure the general population comes along with you and understands what's happening. That's just so important. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that issue of rules and the global governance system, because I can see how Indonesia and non-Western countries would see that the current system of rules, the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, are informed by Western values. And I used to think it had a particular orientation, but to be frank, since President Trump has really stirred things up quite a lot, I guess I'm looking to that period before we had the Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations. And really, it was great power, rule of the jungle kind of an arrangement. The big powers could do whatever they wanted. And for a country like Australia, we benefited hugely from there being rules. It created an opportunity for us to have a say. It meant it bound the great powers to some extent. We knew that there were some guarantees with regard to how they would behave. And here, particularly the World Trade Organization for Australia was massively important because it did constrain tariffs at a minimum, but then increasingly how governments regulated and treated foreign goods and foreign services and investment to some extent coming into their country. So it provided massive stability. It provided an opportunity to hear disputes. It provided an opportunity to negotiate and discuss points of difference. And I think what President Trump has done is he obviously is ignoring all of that. He's definitely ignoring the US's tariff commitments for a range of what I think to be confected reasons. And so really, in many respects, we're sort of back to that rule of the jungle, which is not good for anyone. In many respects, because of Indonesia's size, in terms of population and your huge growth potential, you might potentially be able to navigate this better than Australia can because we depended so heavily on those rules. I guess in terms of what happens to the rules-based system, moving forward. And I think that for me, I'm looking at how other countries who aren't the United States and actually who aren't China, everyone else, what do you foresee other countries, or do you see other countries working together in particular ways to reinforce the rules-based system, or do you think it might be just put on ice until we see how the US, I guess, resolves what it's trying to do? I guess I fear for the rules-based system. I'm not sure what's going to happen to it, but at the same time, it's just so important. Is there something countries like Australia and Indonesia could be doing together to reinforce the rules-based system?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting kind of question or point of discussion. Indonesia and Australia, both of the countries are considered as the middle power, right? Australia is considered as the traditional middle power, but then Indonesia is considered as the emerging middle power. By having said that, we do agree that both countries have their roles in the global arena, with all the limitations, with all the strengths and weaknesses. But then both Australia and Indonesia, I believe, we do have the roles in this kind of global arena within the label or the attribute that we have, like a middle power, but then traditional middle power, then the emerging middle power. The main differences between these two kind of middle power is the aspire to, we do realize limitation as the middle power, but then at the same time, we have the flexibility to also talk to other countries that are not, great powers, right? So that's why I think collaboration between Australia and Indonesia in several kind of international fora will be a very good start for these two countries to contribute to the existing kind of uncertainties. The current situation, I think, is characterized by full of the contradictions, full of the uncertainties, right? At the same time, we realize that there are so many sort of like global challenges that cannot be dealt individually. So we need to collaborate. We are facing the, climate change issues. We are facing some sort of like, sustainability and some other aspects that cannot be solved individually. So it is creating even more interdependence among the countries. But then at the same time, we also see what happened in the United States and other countries. We also see the competition is becoming much more also prevalent. So that's why considering this kind of situations, the attribute as the middle power, both for Australia and Indonesia, in my opinion, should have sort of like, clear kind of role in, in the current situation, especially when we're talking about how to uphold the rules-based system. Country like Australia and also Indonesia, even though during the pre-Bretton Woods system, Indonesia was still not a country yet, we're still under the colonial power, but then the impact of that kind of period gave also a lesson that without the rule system, the world is collapsing. It was not the choice for everyone, and I believe many leaders, despite the fact that all these kind of tensions, we do believe that a rule-based system is still the best way in what is it in governing the anarchic kind of characteristic of the international relations. So that despite the fact that again there has been some sort of like challenges, despite the fact that there has been some sort of like the contradictory kind of situations, but I believe that there are still some countries outside the great powers who still believe in this rules-based system, because again, it will give, as you mentioned earlier, stability, even like providing the platform for the countries to negotiate, solving the dispute, and so on and so forth. However, for some countries, especially the emerging middle power like Indonesia, what sort of like rules-based system matters? How then a country like Indonesia or emerging powers like Indonesia can navigate the need to, achieve the economic kind of, growth and development, while at the same time also having the new responsibilities as the global citizens to also, dealing with the global problems, global issues regarding the climate change and so on and so forth. So that's why what sort of like the question is not whether we agree with the rules-based system, but how or what sort of like systems when we mention about rules-based system. And the emerging powers like Indonesia would like to see that rules-based system that is agreed should also consider the the challenge faced by a country like Indonesia. So that's why there is a sort of like the indications that when we're, for example, when we're talking about the climate change, there should be also upholding principles that common but differentiated responsibility, things like that. So something, and then supporting through the international financial institutions for countries that are still needed, things like that. So that's why the rules-based system, I don't think that will be questionable for a country like Indonesia, which we believe that rules-based system is still at least the best system that we can uphold. However, what sort of like rules-based system that should also be serving the different kind of interest among different level of the countries in terms of their economic development. That also needs to be considered. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, we agree we need rules, but it's okay, what kinds of rules? And that's what's being questioned, has been questioned for increasingly for a long time. So I guess traditionally, and this is from an Australian perspective, the kinds of rules we thought benefited most countries in terms of their economic development were those Washington consensus types of rules.
Yes.
So open markets, rule of law domestically, transparency, deregulation. But I mean, climate change absolutely changes things. I don't know whether there is what kinds of other rules would be put in place, and this is just my ignorance, because I think there's still a fundamental belief in those basic economic rules that are going to deliver the greatest economic growth for countries that implement those rules. So I guess I'd see Indonesia trying to join the OECD because there is a degree of acceptance that those kinds of economic policies are going to benefit Indonesia economically. But then they sit next to industry policies and government intervention in markets, which is sort of contrary to some of those open market sort of policies. So I guess for me, it's going to be really interesting to see how this debate about, okay, we agree we need rules, we need institutions that support maintenance of the rules, but how do we get a greater discussion about what kinds of new rules are needed? But of course, President Trump says, the big guys say we don't need rules, it hasn't actually benefited us. And I remember in the WTO, there used to be this unwritten rule, which was the major trader norm. And that basically said, we have to make sure that the big guys are happy, and as long as, so they have far greater say in terms of how the rules are crafted, because everyone benefits from the rules. So we just want them to buy into the rules. So now the US is no longer buying into at least their tariff obligations and a bunch of other rules as well, and institutions. So, and there are new big countries, and Indonesia is forecast to be one of those big countries. So yeah, really, I guess looking at that issue of how the conversations come together between those that do believe in rules to bring about reform in this really weird context where the big countries are really doing whatever they want to a large extent.
Yeah. I believe, Pro, with the existing system, there are still merits out of it, the system such reciprocal kind of mechanism, safeguard mechanism, those are very important in the current system that should be still upholded. Otherwise, without this, probably that will be also disadvantages for whoever involved in this kind of global economic relations. So again, I think the opportunity, in addition to the reciprocity, in addition to the safeguard mechanism, I think the opportunity for each country to tailor their domestic sort of like policy is also still needed. One thing that we see from the current system that should be reformed is the how do you call it, the intrusive kind of aspect of the global governance within a very deep domestic kind of policy. Probably that should be reformed or should be adjusted in order to make a country like Australia, like Indonesia, or whichever country that should have their autonomy, sort of like, especially regard to protecting their least kind of benefit society in the country. So that's why for me personally, there are some systems, some principles under the existing system, especially, that still need to be upholded. That is the first thing. However, we also require sort of like adjustment by acknowledging the difference in every country's capability to join the existing system. There should be also another aspect. But again, I think it's much more complicated than we can discuss now. There are many aspects that, especially with the current situation, full of contradictions, full of the uncertainties. A country like Indonesia and Australia should have sort of like a spirit together to voice the interest of these middle power sort of like countries' interests, I suppose. Yeah.
Absolutely, a fantastic conversation, and I love the idea that the tensions between the international and the domestic. As an international relations scholar, I don't know, I remember reading years ago John Jared Ruggie and his concept of embedded liberalism.
Yes.
And I always thought the WTO was that step in terms of legalism that really made it much more difficult for domestic governments to manage their domestic issues with all these international pressures. So yeah, we could talk about a lot more and go on. And I really look forward to continuing this conversation in another webinar. We're coming to the end of time. So this has been just a wonderful conversation. Your insights are fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us. And we will take your paper and we will put it on the ACITI website so everyone else can look at that too, and put through to your other publications as well, because we just really look forward to hearing your insights and reading your research. So Poppy, thank you so much for joining us on this webinar.
Thank you, Prue. Have a good day. Bye then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.